Seth, we've got an announcement for a friend.
Oh, nice. What is it? Do I know?
This is very exciting. It's very exciting. You know, our dear friends over at SoberLink. We love SoberLink. We love what SoberLink does in our cases. They have a party coming up. It's maybe less of a party and more of a webinar, but their Holiday Harmony, SoberLink's tools for safe and conflict-free co-parenting is coming up Saturday, November 16th at 9:30 a.m. It is a virtual seminar, webinar, and we're just excited to help them spread the word.
Yeah, and that's Pacific time, I think, Pete, and it is awesome. And the reason why this is such great timing, they're so smart, is as we all know, during the holidays, there's a lot of drinking. And when you are dealing with a co-parent, or you yourself who suffers from alcoholism and needs to have real-time third-party verification check. Like, I'm with the kids, it's the holidays, we're having fun, and I am going to blow into SoberLink device and give you real-time verification that we're good, I'm not drinking, and we're just opening presents on Christmas morning.
That's the deal. You're going to learn more about it. The thing is led by industry leaders Tessa Noel, certified divorce transition coach, and Kylie Wheel, who is program director and course facilitator of Brain Highways. Again, November 16th at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. Thank you, Seth. That's a Saturday. Got some time, Saturday morning, Saturday midday. You should head out there. You can sign up at soberlink.com/holiday-harmony-webinar. Thanks, SoberLink, for being a friend of the show. Welcome to How to Split a Toaster, a divorce podcast about saving your relationships from True Story FM. Today, there's just no great time-sharing plan for a toaster.
Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm Seth Nelson. As always, I'm here with my good friend, Pete Wright. Last week, as you know, we talked about creating a parenting plan with the best interests of the kids as our top priority. Today, we're jumping off that conversation and into the muddy waters of actually parenting kiddos when their lives are split across two homes. Leanne Tran is a registered psychologist who works with children and families. The families count on her to help them understand autism, ADHD, specific learning disorders, and so much more. Pete, here's the question. What do we have to learn about parenting kids across two homes? Maybe the host of a podcast called Parent Like a Psychologist can help. Leanne, welcome to the toaster.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, I'm jumping in, Pete. I know you usually start the show off.
Yeah, it's all you.
But here's my concern. Parent like a psychologist. Here's my concern is I know, and I'm speaking about my uncle, who's a pediatrician. He gave the worst medical advice to his children. And God love my cousins. I don't know how they survived their childhood, but for my aunt that would tell my uncle, you don't know anything about pediatric medicine. Let me care for my children.
Well, let's just say that. Have you ever heard of a podcast called Parent Like a Pediatrician? No.
So, Leanne, I'm just a little suspect. I'm telling you right now, but I think you're going to prove me wrong.
Well, here's what's nerve-wracking for me. I am married to a pediatrician.
Oh my God.
I didn't even know it, Pete.
Wow.
No. So I'm running through in my mind, first of all, should I tell him to make a podcast, Parent Like a Pediatrician? Maybe. But also thinking about now the medical advice he's given our children, and I'm wondering if I need to get a second opinion.
No, I think you need a divorce lawyer. Okay.
Note, Leanne, there's no podcast called Parent Like a Divorce Lawyer. No podcast.
No, probably not.
I'm really glad you're here. This is great timing. It's great timing for us this season. As Seth said in the introduction, we spent last week talking about building a parenting plan, which comes from the perspective so much of the legal, side of the house, which is just the practical. How do you actually do it? What do you write on the plan to make it work? Now we need to talk about the impact of the kids of that plan. Right? Like what happens to kiddos when they're asked to split their lives between two places? Is that too broad a question? Does that give you something to latch on to?
It does. Yeah, it is broad, but also it's not at the same time. I think it really depends on the context. And so for kids, it depends whether their parents are getting along or not getting along. That makes a really big difference because if parents aren't getting along, kids can feel that. If they're trying to compete with each other, kids can feel that. And if they sometimes are overtly putting their kid in the middle, kids can feel that as well. And so that can be really, really disruptive. But assuming things are all going as well as possible, I mean, we talk about divorce being amicable, but it's always like it's not really 100% amicable, even if it is. I think there's always a big change on both people's part. But if things are going as smoothly as possible, the impact it has on kids, I think, is a little bit of a disruption about who they are as people. Where I had my home and community, maybe that's changed a little bit because there's two now. Maybe they've moved out of their home and they're living in two new places. So it kind of can disrupt their sense of identity and connection.
I think the disruption, like it's the parents who got a divorce, right? The parents are inflicting a divorce on the kids, right? If it was 100% amicable, they'd still be married, I'd like to think, right?
That's what I was trying to hint at, yeah.
So when you look at this and when you think about the impact of kids, I'm thinking, like, what are the emotional and behavioral, and I'll separate those two things intentionally, like what are those signs that parents should be on the lookout for that maybe their kids are in some state of distress?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think all kids are different. So I think how you can approach it is by changes. So if you notice things like a change in your child's behavior, normally if they might be acting out a little bit more, or that's probably the biggest one to watch for behavior. And with emotions, it could be that you see the emotions themselves being different, whether that's more moodiness or snapping and more kind of negative emotions. But if you don't see that, there are other things you can watch out for that indicate emotional difficulties, like not sleeping as well as they usually would, potentially not eating the same, feeling tired or lethargic, or where they don't enjoy physical activity or interests and hobbies they used to like. Those things are all changes that point towards some emotional problems underneath.
Now, on that emotional problems underneath, you said something that just, my ears just peaked up there, because you said the divorce could impact the kids on changing their own identity. And that's not something we've heard on the show before, Pete.
No.
I've been doing this a long time. So can you speak to that? Because it seems to me everything you're saying about watch what they're eating, they're not doing the same enjoyment of activities, or maybe they're just like locking themselves in the room longer and being on their electronics longer, which kids these days, it's hard to tell the difference. But it seems like that would be the outward appearance of problems. And one of those problems might be changing their identity. What does that mean?
We form our identity kind of by the messages that are reinforced to us. And maybe I'm thinking about it from this lens of kids who have different needs, who are the ones I work with, ADHD and autistic kids. And with that comes a lot more stressful parenting experience. And in Australia, the rates for divorce of parents of kids with neurodivergence is estimates maybe like up to 75 to 85%. So it's incredibly high.
Well, we're gonna put a pin in that. I'll let you finish your thought. Respect, but
Come back to that.
Wow,
yeah. So oftentimes, if kids are getting, parents are fighting about things, it's usually loud, and kids can hear what they're saying. And if it's about differences in how they approach looking after their child and the stress of trying to manage a child who's got lots of different needs, then kids hear those messages. And so that kind of changes the view of themselves they have. But I think too, I'm thinking about when parents might, a child kind of knows who they are in the context of their family. And that's what kind of gives identity, is those relationships. And when the divorce happens and those things change, kids don't see themselves as from this family anymore. They see themselves as from, that family originally, and then now here and now there. So it does change how they see themselves. If parents support their kids and that goes positively, that's great. If not, then it can kind of lead into a more negative kind of mindset.
When you talk about, like, we talked about parental alienation before on the show, it just seems so much like it's a recipe for that divisiveness that says, the kid is made up of the allegiance to the mom relationship and the allegiance to the dad relationship. And so when the mom and dad get divorced, the kids kind of has to split. Like, that's what I hear. Like, there is a fracturing in that relationship. And that's something I know, Seth, we've talked about a bunch on how parents in deeply contested divorces use that against one another. But I can totally see how that could detrimentally impact child's view of self.
And along with that, Leanne, if I was just thinking that when Pete was kind of describing those allegiances to the parents, I was also just thinking about the dinner routine at a house. And let's say that you have two kids and mom and dad, and the routine is mom makes the meal, the kids set the table, and dad does dishes. But now they're divorced, and everyone has their identity. Everyone knows their role to play, right? Maybe one kid sets, the other kid clears, and now they're divorced. A kid is now being asked to wash the dishes. And like, that wasn't my role. I never washed the dishes. Dad, you did, right? But maybe the mom makes dinner and one kid sets and clears. And so is it confusing for them as their identity and what role they play in this new transition of just daily tasks and routines?
Yeah, I imagine. I mean, I think roles are a little bit different to identity, but they are kind of what forms our identity. You're right.
You hear that, Pete? Do you hear that? She said I was right.
I'm not gonna like put you on a pedestal now. That's what you want.
No, you're just supposed to ring the bell.
All right.
That's
in
all
my
you had
head,
to do.
you now are in the first place. You're like 3 inches higher than me. That's fine.
Keep going, Leanne. Sorry.
You're looking taller already. No, you're looking taller already.
Which is really, really hard for me to do. There's a reason we sit down when we record these podcasts.
So we'll leave those maybe identity issues alone. If you think about it, like that dinner routine's a good example that kids, when they're used to that and that's familiar, then that becomes automatic. And so then they're focusing on all the other things that they're developing, maybe like, friendships and independent skills and that kind of stuff. But then when you're reorganizing all these roles and it becomes conscious again, and it's actively something kids are thinking about, and there's not so much time for focusing on other things. And yeah, so it can kind of add an extra load to what they're already learning and developing as kids.
Part of your specialty in your practice is to work with kids that are neurodiverse. Can you walk us through your perspective on these kids dealing with the same kind of issues we've just set up, right? Living in, being asked to split their life between two homes, two parents. What are the kinds of things like that they're going to need to be, that the parents are going to need to be considerate of to help their kids thrive?
Firstly, I guess the most common things I'm thinking about are ADHD and autism. With ADHD, as you might know, Pete, if you mentioned that before, it's more difficult to be organized. It's often executive functioning is a challenge for these kids, which means I explain it to parents as essentially the ability to do the task in the moment. And so with that comes maybe a lot of forgetfulness. Forgetfulness is probably the biggest one, but disorganization, distractibility, and all of that kind of stuff. And so then how that affects across two homes then is that it requires an extra level of organization to be moving between two homes. And when you have a difficulty in organization, that's going to be incredibly hard for you. So lots of things like, I always recommend to parents to have doubles of everything, particularly for their kids with ADHD, because it's going to be really difficult to remember what they need to bring from house to house. Do they have the homework at the right house or the assignment pieces?
So, Leanne, on that point, as much as that is so important for the kids that you're describing, it's for all kids.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, literally, when my son was little, and his mom and I had split up when he was 2.5, and now he was 5 or 6 playing soccer. And it helped that I had the finances to do this, but we would go get his soccer stuff, and we would pay for an extra uniform. We would buy 2 sets of cleats and 2 bags, and inevitably, I call it the Great Migration. Somehow I would end up with all of them at my house. And I don't know, the whole concept was that this didn't happen. And this would be like on shorts. I would say, why do I have 20 pairs of shorts and 3 t-shirts? I'm sure every time you arrived at the house, you had shorts and t-shirts on. And every time you left the house, you had shorts and t-shirts on. But it gets messed up. And you have to have the reorganization.
Yeah.
But it's hard. It's hard.
But when executive functioning is broken because you're a teenager, right? You're already compromised just because you're a teenager. And athletic clothes seem to multiply asexually anyway. So that just kind of goes without saying. Then you add the neurodiverse part, and we're talking about sort of advocating for consistency and predictability and fighting for that as a parent as best you can. And that means, Seth, to your point, that reorganization, it's got to be a way of life. Every Friday, you got to do a reorg.
In Leanne, these parents might not agree what is best for this child and think, no, he doesn't need the little widget tool that he can play with his hands with when we're eating dinner. It's okay otherwise, and so one parent allows it at dinner, the other parent doesn't allow it at dinner. And for that child, that is a huge issue.
Yeah, that's right. Your point about these challenges being ones that all kids face is true. So the challenges themselves aren't that different. But in terms of executive functioning, it's estimated that kids with ADHD may be 30% behind where other kids their age are. So it just means that they're going to have more trouble with this stuff and maybe take longer. And so even the teenagers you mentioned, then when you add on top of that teenage brain an extra 30% of difficulty, it becomes quite a lot. I think, Seth, you made a good point. What it really comes down to is, are parents on the same page about these things or not? Because all kids need predictability and consistency. But if you aren't on the same page about what they need to support ADHD and autism, then that's where the challenges will really happen, especially if you're trying to kind of not just decide for the sake of it that you'll meet in the middle somewhere and follow a consistent plan, even if you don't quite believe in the diagnosis.
Can we dive in just a little bit more detail on the autism situation? Because I know that there are sensory issues with ADHD that come with ADHD, depending on where you are on the spectrum. I know that with autism, that sensory experience, it can be magnified depending on, again, where you are on the spectrum. And I'm wondering how you work with parents to communicate that has to be accounted for twice, right? And the role of, again, that consistency and stability in 2 different homes, so that every time you deal with a time-sharing swap, you're not dealing with a potential sensory meltdown.
Yeah, it's a big conversation because with autism, there's 2 main parts to the disability. The first part is social communication, and the second part is behavior. So different behavior, which includes that sensory processing, but the other part is it's called restricted behavior. And what it really means is needing things to, I guess in summary, it kind of means not being flexible with a lot of things, which means that need for sameness and routine and difficulty with transition, which is a change from one thing to the other. And all of those things are inherent in the change between two households. So we talk a lot about how it's really important to understand the sensory needs for one and make sure that those are catered for in both homes, but also to think about keeping the routine the same across both homes and trying to help particularly with the transition as well between one to the other. It's quite common for kids to be upset after a transition or just kind of a bit dysregulated. And for autistic kids, it can be a bigger response. So maybe a couple of days, they're really out of sorts.
So, Leanne, on that, the general thought process is with non-neurodivergent kids is when they're younger, you tend to do what we call a 2-2-3 schedule, where they're with mom for 2 days, with dad for 2 overnights, with mom for the weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, then with dad for 2 days and mom. So a lot of back and forth. But they say kids are younger, they need more constant contact as opposed to week on, week off. With the change issue with neurodivergent kids is kind of the default, no matter whatever the age is, to be week on, week off. So they have some change. Let's say the exchange happens on a Friday. They have the weekend to kind of get to this new routine. We try to make it as consistent as possible. Maybe we have the same mattress. Maybe we have the same sheets. Maybe we have the same pillow, the same silverware, the same plates and cups, the same soaps. I mean, all these things, but there's still a change. And therefore, maybe they have a better school week because by the time Monday rolls around, we've transitioned. Is that something that parents of neurodivergent kids should be considering?
It is what I see a lot. I don't know whether it's just a difference in Australia as to how we typically do things, but I think definitely once kids are at school, it is more along the lines of what I see. Yeah. Or in some situations, depending on a parent's work, and I'm thinking it's typically father's work is maybe shift work or something, then they may be with dad on the weekend or that parent on the weekend and the other parent for the school week so that routine can be consistent.
Man, I can't imagine a 2-2-3 with a young kid. That seems so disruptive to me, especially when you talk about a kid who takes 2 days to adjust to any particular transition.
It's constantly adjusting.
Constantly adjusting. How do you ever find any sense of regulation out of dysregulation?
Yeah, that's what makes it really hard because, like we were talking before, when you're trying to adjust, that's what your mind's focusing on. And when we're regulated is when all the learning happens and the growth and development. So if kids are constantly kind of in that stress state or that adjustment state, it can really affect their development and learning.
Let's talk about siblings of neurodivergent kids. What is the impact on the sibling in a situation like this?
It varies a lot, but I guess it varies from being potentially an experience for the sibling of being relied on to handle things and cope because parents are, almost inadvertently saying, I kind of really need all my focus to be over here. So I need you to be okay. So they feel this pressure to kind of just handle everything and be okay. Or on the other extreme, maybe they are seen as someone who might be able to help the child, and that puts a lot of pressure on as well. So if it's helping them at school, look after your little brother and that kind of thing, that can put a lot of pressure on siblings as well. And then there's a whole spectrum in between. But I think it's worthwhile not underestimating the impact it can have because parenting a child with additional needs takes up more time. So unless you intentionally think about how it's affecting the sibling and what you can do to counteract any negative impacts, their needs will kind of go unseen in the complicated family life.
I feel like I'm just trying to think about all the other stakeholders who exist. We've got siblings, we've got the parents. We're transitioning now into an era where maybe the one parent brings in a new partner for a neurodiverse kid. How do you talk about the new partner in a relationship where parents are trying to co-parent across two homes with a neurodiverse kiddo?
It's probably not that different to how you would do things with a neurotypical kid, except that your communication would be more intentional and maybe you would take smaller steps to do it. So yeah, maybe it actually is different as I'm talking out loud.
It's very similar, except
in the way it's not.
Except for the 99 points I'm about to make. And Pete, please let Andy know we're going to extend this podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll 24 hours.
We'll
see you tomorrow.
Well, we're going to catch up with her because she's on Australian time. So we got 12 hours to do this, Pete.
That's right. We'll be fine.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that maybe this is a better way to say it. The principles are the same, but the communication needs to be a little bit clearer and the steps would maybe go slower. So maybe introducing the person first and spending time together, getting to know each other a little bit, and then gradually extending that a little bit, and then talking about intentionally and explicitly talking about what changes to the routine might happen with this person joining the family, and so that kids can incorporate that into their understanding of the routine.
I think about the experience of, being neurodiverse in just the little ways that I am. And I think about what it means to be empathetic to new emotional stimuli. And I imagine that a kiddo is going to be living that experience writ large, right? That they're going to be a raw nerve to the consistency and stability, sensory stability that they had watching one intimate relationship in their parents and being introduced to another intimate relationship and having to feel their way through that and not being able to regulate is a massive challenge.
All at the same time that they are developing their own relationship with that person.
Yes.
Because even if they're saying, no, I don't want to get to know you or anything, by the fact that they're in your life, you have a relationship with them. So yeah, the kids are trying to do that at the same time.
Seems like a lot to put on a kid.
God, I'm glad I'm not a kid anymore.
Yeah.
You guys, how hard must it be?
Yeah.
And now you add social media and they're carrying around their phones, and there's a lot of ways our lives were easier way back when.
Oh, for sure. Well, and I think, in some respects, Seth, too, the tools we have to deal with it are more robust, and that requires kind of a lesson in and of itself. And so, Leanne, maybe you could talk through your recommendation for parents dealing with the universe of therapeutic options, right? What role do you count on for a therapist and for other supports in the divorce process to help the parents and the kids? Do you have a curriculum?
Kind of, but it's very individual because kids are all different. There's probably two parts to it. And the first part is how parents can get on the same page. And then the second part is how professionals can help. And the first bit really needs to happen first, I think, because if parents aren't on the same page about the plan for their children, then it's very difficult for other professionals to help. So a big example about that is with ADHD. It's often the first line intervention is medication, and that's something that parents really commonly disagree about. And
no, come on, man.
Yeah.
That never happens.
It always happens, Seth.
Lunacy.
That's the first thing. But then also if it's a plan about, does Does the child need a psychologist? Do they? And it's usually about how parents see the needs. One will say, look, they need all this help, and one will say, they're fine, you're overreacting. And unless they can sort of somehow end up on the same page, it makes it really difficult for people like pediatricians or psychologists to actually enact a plan, because the follow through on the other side is just really different. But then in terms of how we can help, I'm a psychologist, so I guess I'll talk about my role, and it's often about helping develop kids' skills so that they can handle these things in life better. But it's also about teaching parents ways that they can adapt what they're doing to help their kids.
And that's the hardest for a parent, to tell a parent, like, oh, you got to do something different. Your kid will respond differently.
It is, but the thing is, it's the fastest way to change, because we've already talked about how much load these kids are under. So then to expect them also to be able to develop some coping skills when their brains aren't fully formed yet is a big ask. And if you have ever tried to change a habit as an adult, you'll recognize how hard it is to change how you do things. And that's for us with fully formed brains and maturity.
Well,
some of us.
Yeah. Well, I do. I don't know about you two, but no, just so it is the fastest way. So it's really got to be about two things: the kids learning skills, but then how are you doing things differently at home? But it's also, if we're teaching kids skills, that's an hour a week with a psychologist at the most, I would say. And then they've got all of the rest of their time with their family. And so if you're not encouraging them or
practicing and reinforcing, and
yeah, that's right, then they're getting a little message from me about what to do, but lots of messages from you about different ways to do it. And it's really hard to get any movement.
This is fascinating. And I have to say, Seth, I feel like I have already seen some wheels turning on just how you think about some of these relationships from the legal perspective. What are you hearing? Like, do you hear ways you might be rethinking how you handle a parenting plan in certain cases?
The direct answer is yes. The more nuanced answer is how to get people on the same page on a parenting plan when, frankly, we're in mediation and they're also negotiating alimony and who's going to get the house. Like some of the nuances that are so important in kids on routine and being on the same page don't seem that important when you're like, what house are they going to live in? How am I going to pay the mortgage? Like these other stressors take kind of priority in the moment, even though in reality, it should be reversed, because you can live in house A or house B, sell and get a different house, smaller, as long as it's in the same school district. There's a lot of choices on houses, but every day that you have with your kid and you have that time, and Leanne spent an hour with them on Tuesday at 3, and now you've got a parent the other times, you're going to be parenting no matter what house you live in.
I just have to say, I'm reading this book, and it doesn't even matter what it's called, but there is a concept in there called priority dilution. Have you ever heard of this concept?
I have not.
Okay, so the concept, it's basically like this. Say you have a drink that you love, whatever drink it is, and you slowly start pouring water into it. Eventually, and how long depends on the drink, the more water you put in, the less and less it tastes like your drink, right? Everything becomes bland. If you are confronted with a whole lot of super urgent, high priority things, eventually none of them are high priority anymore because they dilute themselves. And the major outcome of this is you'll forget the difference between urgent and important. And you just described that for me, Seth. People are when moods are heightened, they forget that all of the questions that are presented to them as urgent might not be the important questions. The urgent things are like, who's going to sign on the line to split the house? The important thing is, what's going to happen to my relationship with my neurodivergent son if I play this wrong, right? If I play this in a way that's the long-term thing. And I feel like that conceit is something I've really been thinking a lot about, especially in the context of divorce.
And when that happens, what I've noticed is we deal with the urgent, like you're saying, and maybe some of that is also important, but in the emotional stressors that the divorce process brings, once you solve one problem that maybe isn't important and urgent, let's just say that they have them lined up properly, in quotes, properly. We solve the problem, then we do the next problem. And then now we're down to stuff that's really not that important, but they're just going to die on that hill. And I go back to them and I said, what were your goals? What were you trying to achieve during this process? And I said, give me your top 3, then bracket 4, 5, 6. And now we're arguing about number 12. Like, let's be done.
Yeah.
Like, you can call it moving the goalpost and calling it a win if there's any such thing, which I don't believe there is in family court. But let's be done. And what happens is they keep, now that's in my rear view. This is the next important thing. Now this is really important. And it moves up the ladder.
From a psychology perspective, I talk with kids a lot about how when we're really upset, some research studies have showed that our IQ we operate at an IQ level that's half of what we normally have.
And Pete, when you're mad, you're still a genius.
That was weirdly a compliment and a slam. That was great. A nice compliment.
I appreciate
great.
That's right. Half of a very high number is still high. But I think that when you were talking, Seth, it reminds me of that we're not as rational, right, when we're really upset. And so that can kind of feed into our decision making and maybe deciding whether things are urgent or important. But also, you probably have heard about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, how, the bottom ones are safety and shelter. And so that makes sense that parents kind of go into that primal mode of thinking, okay, we need a roof over our heads and that kind of thing. And you can't really focus on those higher level things unless you've got those bottom ones secured.
But with all the hurricanes coming through, roof over our heads in Florida is a luxury these days.
Yeah, you've had, 2?
I don't even live there, and all I can tell you is too soon, man. It's too soon.
Too soon
this season.
Too soon. Okay, we'll have Andy cut it. He'll put it on the top. Thanks, Andy.
He'll put it on the top.
Leanne, first off, I got to tell you, you're very impressive. But we should also let people know you're very impressive at 7 a.m. because that's what time it is when we're recording this in Australia.
So grateful for you to do this with us, Leanne. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks so much for having me. It's so great to be able to share this kind of information for parents.
Where would you like people? We'll put links to everything we mentioned. The podcast, Parent Like a Psychologist. We'll put your website in the show notes. Any place else specifically you'd like to send people to learn more about you and your work?
I think the website is a great place which is leannetran.com.au if parents are looking for one-on-one work or courses that I offer for parents to learn all of this stuff about understanding their child. Otherwise, the podcast, which pushes out to then YouTube, and there's some parts on Instagram as well, give free information for parents on lots of different topics. So, yeah, that's where I would go.
I've been listening to your ADHD episodes all afternoon, so thank you for those resources.
Have you?
For sure.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yes.
Yeah.
Leanne, this has been great. Sure appreciate you for hanging out with us and bringing this subject to our listeners. And thank you, everybody, for downloading and listening to this show. We appreciate your time and attention. On behalf of Leanne Tran from Down Under and Seth Nelson, America's favorite divorce attorney, I'm Pete Wright, and we'll see you next time right here on How to Split a Toaster, a divorce podcast about saving your relationships.
How to Split a Toaster is part of the True Story FM podcast network, produced by Andy Nelson, music by T. Bless and the Professionals and DB Studios. Seth Nelson is an attorney with NLG Divorce and Family Law with offices in Tampa, Florida. While we may be discussing family law topics, How to Split a Toaster is not intended to, nor is it providing legal advice. Every situation is different. If you have specific questions regarding your situation, please seek your own legal counsel with an attorney licensed to practice law in your jurisdiction. Pete Wright is not an attorney or employee of NLG Divorce and Family Law. Seth Nelson is licensed to practice law in Florida.